All right, good afternoon. I'm Pete Daly, CEO and publisher of the U.S. Naval Institute, and I welcome our audience both here in the Jack C. Taylor Center's Lockheed Auditorium and our remote audience who's joining us online. And so for those who are here, I just ask you to stand for a minute and let's say the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Special shout out to Admiral Kacher, who's the acting superintendent and one of our Naval Institute press authors. This is a moment. Today's event demonstrates what the Naval Institute is all about. We're an open, independent, nonpartisan forum that dares to read, think, speak, and write. The Institute, since its inception 150 years ago, it's coming up the anniversary in just a couple weeks, supports our men and women in the sea services and has always championed their viewpoints, their exchange of ideas. The title of today's discussion is Competition or Confrontation, the Urgent Realities for the U.S. Navy when Facing China's People's Liberation Army Navy. Our moderator today is Jude Blanchette, who will lead a discussion with three of our great panelists, all of whom are Naval Institute Press authors. Jude Blanchette holds the Freeman Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And previously, he was Engagement Director at the Conference Board's China Center for Economics and Business in Beijing, where he researched China's political environment with a focus on the workings of the Communist Party of China and its impact on foreign companies and investors. Jude was the Assistant Director of the 21st Century China Center at the University of California, San Diego, and he's been published in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and his translations have been published in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. The most recent book that Jude Blanchette has published is China's New Red Guards, Return of Radicalism, and the Rebirth of Mao Zedong, published by the Oxford University Press. This will be about a 60-minute program. We ask you, if you haven't already done so, to please put your phone on silent or stun, and that'll allow people to hear the program uninterrupted. And for those, we are going to do questions at the end of those 60 minutes. And for those who are in the audience, we have microphones deployed here at the front of these two center aisles. And for our online audience, we're going to have a chat feature enabled, and you can chat in your question. We do ask that you ask a question, and please identify yourselves so we know who you are. After the panel discussion, the panelists and the moderator will be available again for any follow-on questions you have, and a book signing continues out in the foyer area where you came in. So I'd ask our panel to come out, please, and join us, and we'll get started. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. I keep giving him a PhD, to Jude Blanchette. Thank you for joining us today and agreeing to be a moderator, and thank you to our panelists in advance. Over to you.
And thank you. It just saved me 7 years of course and field work to get a PhD and $100,000, so I appreciate that.
Well, the only PhD I'm ever going to get is my initials. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for the welcome, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and especially honored to share the podium with three individuals who have thought deeply and hard about a complicated set of problems around U.S. national security and a critical problem of how we think about China, the PLA, how we think about China and Russia. These are all at the heart of a set of really confounding issues. Oftentimes when you moderate, you have to struggle to think about how you're going to get the panelists to speak, how you're going to ask the right questions. But this is really, here this is going to be easy for me because we have 3 authors of 3 really wonderful new books, which I hope everyone has purchased, that really give just a master class in analytic perception, depth of research, and we're going to get a taste of that today. As I think has already been mentioned, the flow is we'll have a discussion here. We'll turn to each of the speakers in turn to give 5 to 7 minutes of top-line thoughts, and then we'll go into a discussion, and around 55 minutes in, we'll turn to a Q&A. Just very, very briefly, going from my immediate right, thrilled to have Admiral Mike McDevitt, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Naval Analysis, or CNA. Prior to this, spent 34 years in the Navy, doing everything across the board, including 4 at-sea warship commands, including of an aircraft carrier battle group. And his wonderful new book is China as a 21st Century Naval Power. It looks boring from up here only because I had to remove the dust jacket, but it really is a penetrating, powerful book. We have Xiaobing Li, who's a professor in the Don Betts Endowed Chair in International Studies at the University of Central Oklahoma, who himself has written a really fantastic history of the PLA Navy, tracing it all the way back to its antecedents and how it grew and developed and learned throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then last but not least, we have Brent Sadler, who is a senior research fellow for naval warfare and advanced technology in the Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. And before that, 26-year Navy veteran, numerous operational tours on nuclear-powered submarines, and the author of this fantastic book, U.S. Naval Power in the 21st Century, which, as he was just pointing out to me, has an aircraft carrier on the cover, not a submarine, earning him the enmity of all his fellow submariners.
Sad but true.
So without further ado, why don't we'll get right into it. I'll turn to Mike first, and we'll go down the line for initial comments.
Sure. Thanks, Jude. And I'd first like to thank Admiral Daly and the Naval Institute Press. To my surprise, they actually agreed to publish a book that I wrote. I've been a life member here, and it's a delight to be back and have this opportunity to talk about. Let me start with, where's the PLA Navy heading? That seems to be the question that a lot of people ask in terms of how many ships, what capabilities, and what have you. And the answer is, we really don't know for sure. Their objective force, the strength that they will eventually wind up at, is classified. It is a secret in China. So all we can say for sure is it's going to be big. Xi Jinping several years ago said he wants the entire PLA, including the Navy, to be world class. And he says, I want this to be done largely, not completely, but largely by 2035, and then have it done for sure by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Now, we don't have any idea how Xi Jinping defines world class. Could it mean without peer? We just don't know. And so let me give you my assertion of what world class means. It's going to be large enough and capable enough to establish sea control in strategically important regions to China. And the most important regions are the Western Pacific, and I would argue the sea lanes across the Indian Ocean. Now, this is not a pipe dream. Today, the PLA Navy is the second most capable Navy in the world in terms of a mix of destroyers, minesweepers, frigates, 3 aircraft carriers, submarines. It is balanced. It is essentially mimicking the U.S. Navy's approach to full coverage of all of the maritime mission areas. It's larger than the U.S. Navy. I know that's a shock to many people. About 340 or so what the U.S. calls battle force ships, the ships that the U.S. Navy counts. So compared to about 300 for the U.S. Navy. So the U.S. Navy is already outnumbered, if you will. But we need to unpack those numbers a bit. We need to look at what I would call or define as blue water warships. In other words, nuclear attack submarines, aircraft carriers, Aegis destroyers, and so forth. And when you count up those kinds of ships, the U.S. has about 180, and the PLA Navy has about 115. So why are they so big? It's a fair question to ask, and the reason is they have a lot of smaller frigates and corvettes, conventionally powered submarines that are used mainly in the seas around China, the East China Sea, South China Sea, Yellow Sea, and what have you, for the defense of China. The PLA Navy is built primarily to defend China from attack from the sea, which of course is something that happened to China repeatedly in the 19th century and early in the 20th century, being invaded from abroad. So, for example, they have about 50 conventional diesel submarines, 90-odd small corvettes and frigates. And so an important thing to think about when you look at the totality of the Western Pacific is that if it turns out there's a fight, the PLA Navy is not going to fight alone. They have the entire PLA Air Force, they have the land-based PLA Navy Air Force, and they have the PLA Rocket Force there as part of a joint campaign on their part. And they make sure they can use all of those systems effectively because of a really incredibly effective open ocean surveillance system. Let me finish up with a thought on, everybody asks, how good are these guys? And I think the answer is, we don't know for sure. Again, the 7th Fleet, I'm sure, keeps track of what they're up to and what they're doing, and draws some conclusion about their operational performance. I've been watching what they've been doing during peacetime exercises and how they've managed to conduct operations in the far reaches of the Indian Ocean, their anti-piracy patrols, and they seem to be competent. Their ships are not breaking down. They don't have to send a tugboat along like the Russians do to make sure that they have somebody to bring them home if the engineering plant fails. So perhaps more telling is what Xi Jinping and senior PLA leaders have to say. They are often harshly critical. They publicly criticize the entire PLA for not being good enough, for suffering from peacetime disease, for not conducting realistic and rigorous enough training. They keep emphasizing that the objective is not simply to fight. The objective is to fight and win. Keep in mind, we're talking about a party navy. Strictly speaking, this is not a national navy. The PLA Navy is an element of the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping never lets them forget that. He and senior uniformed leaders never fail to mention that loyalty to the party is paramount. Officers and sailors alike are required to study and be tested on Xi Jinping thought. In short, the PLA Navy is expected to be completely and reliably read, as well as proficient in combat at sea. And the final point I would make is the shared command between the warship's captain and the ship's political officer is a potential weakness, one that is foreign to the Western tradition of naval command, and because in this case, the commanding officer and the political officer are essentially co-equal. Now, this is the only system that the PLA Navy officers have ever known. So, but what we don't know is, what we do know is it has never been actually tested in modern war at sea. So let me end there and look forward to your questions.
Great, thanks, Mike. Xiaoping?
Okay, thank you. Well, my book traces the evolution of the PLA Navy by examining his adaptation, modernization, and setbacks over the past 60 years. Based on newly available Chinese sources and personal interviews, the book offers a Chinese perspective of the PLAN warfighting history. Again, as Admiral McDavid mentioned here, so what we can learn from his past, what his operational history can help us have a better understanding of today's Chinese Navy's operation and strategy. So this book shows that the Chinese Navy lacked the war fighting experience. So the early experience in the Cold War had a very strong impact on today's naval behavior and the strategic culture of the Chinese Navy. So as Admiral Liu Huaqing, the former PLA Navy commander, or known as China's Alfred Mahan, emphasized Chinese Navy's active role to project Chinese power status in East Asia. So Xi Jinping supported Admiral Liu's perception and had this proactive defense, which has shifted from engaging in land wars in the neighboring countries like Korea and Vietnam to preparing for naval warfare in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait. It's happening. For example, in the Taiwan Strait, the PLA Navy is preparing for 2A and area denial, prepared for the joint operations, as Michael mentioned here, and also strengthened their combined naval forces, including Navy, Coast Guard, and the armed fishermen or militias. For example, in the offshore island like Jinmen or Komoe. So here what's going on today. First, the local government of the Fujian province established a county government of Jinmen on the mainland China. And then in July, the Quanzhou city government issued an announcement offering the Chinese ID for those residents from Jinmen who engage in the business, construction, and education and family relations on the mainland. So next month, there's going to be a talk between Quanzhou city government and the Jinmen county government about cross-strait gas line pipe construction and underwater electricity cable. So according to their proposal, they prepared a proposal for next month, they will include an article or items about joint administrative authority or joint administration between mainland local government and Jinmen county government. Because we will have thousands of Chinese workers going to your island, working on those joint ventures. And you have your 40% of residents now taking the Chinese ID. So it's reasonable, it's natural for the Chinese join your administration on this island. Anyway, you're only a few miles away from the mainland. Of course, Taiwanese government will reject this local deal, but unfortunately, Jinmen is not a green county, which is a blue county. So what Taiwanese government can do is send reinforcement to Jinmen garrison. Now the PLA Navy is prepared for a war they like to fight, engage against Taiwanese Navy by defeating the American technology which had been equipped to Taiwanese Navy along the offshore areas. So that's the first preparation for these 2A and AD operation between Taiwan and Jinmen. Second, and joint occupation, joint operation with other services for possible war over Jinmen. And then the combined forces. This is very traditional Chinese. If you look at the history of the naval operation, during the landing campaign of Yijiangshan and Dacheng, East Sea Fleet mobilized Coast Guard and militias. In the battles over Spaki Island, Paracel Island, South China Sea, the South Sea Fleet mobilized the Hainan Coast Guard and, again, local militias. Actually, those militias opened fire first at Vietnamese. They took over those islands, not Marine Corps, not naval sailors, but militias. So again, any operation in the future against those offshore islands like Jinmen and Mazu going to be involved Chinese Navy, Coast Guard, and militias. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Xiaobing. Brent?
Thanks again for having me. So when I was writing the book, there was one, admonishment, and Sun Tzu, of course, gets overquoted, but I think it really plays out. And with the three of us up here, three authors up here, and that is, you need to understand your adversary deeply, and then you also have to understand your own capabilities in yourself also as deeply, if not more, in order to put together an effective approach. And so what U.S. naval power in the 21st century is trying to do is to try to embrace that. And there's 3 points that I'll make, and I'll try to be brief so we can get to the interaction, but with you all here and the folks online. First off, at least when I first really started looking at this problem set of and what shall we do about a confidently belligerent China, that was in 2010, was actually realizing over the several years in several cases that U.S. concepts of statecraft are failing. And the reason they're failing is that they're not embracing the reality that we've been in for well over 10 years. So that's one of the core principles or organizing constructs in the book. And that construct is what I call naval statecraft. It's the merging of developmental economics with a very proactive and focused diplomacy backed by a forward naval presence. Now that's not Navy, that's naval, so that's also other elements of government power and economics and commercial sectors. But the core of it's actually the one that more directly a president can move around for specific strategic objectives, the U.S. Navy, and that's what the rest of the book follows in and lays out. It also has a very long-term view, looking at out to 2050, the environmental as well as the demographic changes, the economic pressures that are going to be dictating where the U.S. Navy needs to be and where these challenges and demands are going to come. Which really gets into the second point that I want to make, and that is the nature of our principal foe, the Chinese Communist Party, where they're weakest at and where we are strongest in leveraging allies and partners across the world and in the power of ideas is actually rooted in a maritime approach. And I'm not one to argue for more strategies. I think those that we have, like the National Defense Strategy going back to 2018 and slightly modified, is a continuation of that we've got it about right. It's just we got to start doing and taking actions in a more concerted and effective way. That's the second point. And the third and final point that I want to make, and again, there's a fair dose of the book in this which talks about how do you build the right force, how do you employ the right force. And the first thing I'll say is after you go through all that, understanding how the Chinese operate and how we have to operate, we have to reorganize. On the scale of which we did entering into our first Cold War with the Soviet Union in 1948. It's the National Security Act, which reorganized. It created the Central Intelligence Agency. It created the Department of Defense. Before that, you had the Department of War and you had the Department of Navy. We might need to revisit the way that we're structured if we ever hope to be effective in this new Cold War that we find ourselves in. So reorganization has to be embraced and it should not be resisted. A couple of other key points on that is we have limited resources, so we have to play our hand where it has the biggest impact, strategic impact. And in the book, I go to great lengths to talk about a hold, a build, and an advanced. And so this is actually mirroring the first, second, and third island chain construct. Again, looking at how our adversaries view the world and how we can actually get around that. And based on those kind of constructs, we can get into more in the Q&A what that is and examples. But the decisive theaters where the United States must act and where it will actually have the biggest rallying effect to our allies and partners is Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, there's an active war going on now. China is invested in that region as well as the Russians. And I'll touch on the Russians before I close. And then, most importantly, the second decisive theater is the South China Sea, where China has been very aggressive in the last few years, and it's actually modifying and adjusting its modus operandi there and its cabbage strategy or gray zone tactics as we speak. It's much more confident, which requires the United States to tailor its approaches to these two regions and others. And one last point, and the reason why I touched on Russia, there's a lot of folks will kind of disparage the Russians and say they're not really what we should be worried about. That would be misplaced. They may not be the principal threat for us, but they can cause a lot of death and destruction, as Ukrainians are finding now. So we have to take them serious from that perspective as a distraction, a strategic distraction. And so the strategy of the book also talks about the importance of balancing so that actions that are taken, investments made with respect to China cannot be derailed by passing political or diplomatic urgencies to deal with a Russia or another. And so keeping strategic clarity and strategic focus is another key thing, which again the book goes into great detail about. And it lays out not a strategy, a framework, an organizing principle in which to try to put in place a very proactive national power towards specific objectives, at the end of the day, to prevent a war and bloodshed this decade, which is, some would say, the most dangerous decade that we've faced in the history of the country. And with that, thank you.
Great, thanks, Brent. Just a few quick follow-up questions to the three speakers, and we'll go to Q&A. Mike, I wonder if I can start with you. And you were touching on this in the unique aspects of the structure of the PLA as a party army rather than a nationalized army. One of the things about a rapid military buildup is your sort of physical hardware goes faster than the software and the human component, and it takes 15 years to get 15 years of experience. So what's your assessment of how, as you watch the PLA operate, as you look at how well it operates jointly, and just your own understanding of having spent 34 years in the Navy and knowing how important judgment is, experience. A lot of these, the PLA is lacking. Xiaobing has written a lot about the last time China was in an outright war, which was 1979. So they've sort of been watching with their face pressed against the window. What do you think are going to be the real strengths and weaknesses on that software side, the human capital side within the PLA?
Well, the first thing to recognize is the leadership of China and the leadership of the PLA recognizes what you just said. It's not a mystery to them that they have no experience. And that's what I suggested, that they keep harping, as I said, in very strident and sometimes embarrassing language, calling out the PLA, different branches for one thing or another, for not training hard enough, not being tough enough. Now, to the Navy, in the book I focus on how important it is now almost 13 years that the PLA Navy has sent a small task group to the far reaches of the Indian Ocean, usually a destroyer and a frigate and an oiler, or two frigates, whatever it is, two warships and an oiler. And they're not just going there point A to point B, they actually do operations. And this is a 5 or 7 month deployment. And so they have been, as I say, been doing that for almost 13 years. When one of these task groups arrives in the Northern Arabian Sea, the one that's been relieved, except during COVID, this was changed, but then does port calls around the littoral of Africa or an Eastern Med or South Asia and what have you, to get experience. And so, as I say, they have a cadre of flag officers and officers and sailors who have been out maintaining a ship, keeping a ship running at sea for a very long period of time. And those of you who have ever deployed on a ship, you know that it is a challenge just to keep everything ticking over. And so now, nobody's been shooting at them, but then again, nobody's been shooting at us either. And so we don't know how that would pan out. But they're using these anti-piracy patrols, which are effectively patrolling their sea lanes. They use these anti-piracy patrols, I think, mainly as a training event. That the sailors have to go out and be on their own, thousands of miles away from home port for a substantial period of time.
Just a quick follow-up on that. One of the things that Xi Jinping has talked about is the importance of joint warfighting capability. But when you look at the composition of the Central Military Commission, it's become less joint over time, right? So it's still overwhelmingly Army-dominated. There's no Navy. I think there's one Navy presence, but it's a commissar, it's a political commissar role. How do you read that signal? Because it's confusing on the one hand what everyone knows the PLA needs to fight and win wars, but how the leadership is reflecting that in terms of who's advising Xi Jinping. Well,
as a retired naval officer, I bridle at the fact that the Navy doesn't have a seat at the table, but the reality is they just fired the head of the rocket force and his political commissar, the two top leaders of the PLA rocket force, and they brought in quote a full admiral. He's all of a sudden dumped in there as the head of the rocket force, and a full force, or the equivalent of a four-star Air Force officer, and dumped him in there as a political commissar and said, okay, you're now in charge of the rocket force. I'd like to think that's because naval officers can do anything, but but the reality is that it is an Army-centric system. But increasingly, in terms of where you look at the resources are going, where they're going, the Army has gotten smaller. They've been the bill payer for the Navy and for the Air Force and the Rocket Force. The Army has lost a lot of men and what have you, and they're struggling perhaps more than the other services with learning how to be joint. They've been camping out in one garrison somewhere for 20-odd years. All of a sudden, they have to show up at quote, a joint headquarters to be a J5, and they say, what in the world's a J5? And so this is, the entire PLA is in the throes of this problem, learning how to be joint. But the Army, I think, is the one that is most affected by it. So I wouldn't read too much into the fact that there's all green suits sitting around. So.
Xiaobing, your book traces the entire historical arc of naval thinking in the Communist Party of China and then the evolution of the PLA. I'm curious, one of the big discussion points now is what lessons is the PLA learning from the war in Ukraine? I have a more general question, though, which is, the subtitle of your book is The Evolution of the PLAN. Well, looking out over the past 70 plus years, what drives evolutions and change in the PLA? Is it them watching other powers fight in wars? Is it them operating in their sort of near seas and figuring out what works and what doesn't? Are they studying textbooks? What drives change and innovation in the PLA?
Well, probably the major reason is the national security concerns and also the civil struggle across the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan had been a priority for Chinese military development since 1949. But in the recent years, Chinese really learned the lessons about the war overseas from 1950 to 1970s. The current leader believed that we can win without American intervention. So actually, Chinese Navy tried to avoid direct confrontation with the American Navy and the American Armed Forces in the places like Taiwan Strait. They believe they have a better chance to win without American intervention. So with that in mind, they try to prepare to win the war against neighboring navies like Taiwanese Navy, Japanese Navy, and others. So they like to have a war experience with those navy without American intervention.
Just quickly, Xiaobing, Mike was just mentioning some of the, like, politely we could call it personnel changes in the PLA rocket force. We have the defense minister who hasn't been seen since the 29th of last month. Yeah. We've got changes in the PLA. Undoubtedly, there's going to be, we're in the middle of what's clearly a significant purge. Mm-hmm. We have the foreign minister, Qin Gang, who's hopefully vacationing in a dacha somewhere, but could be much worse. Yeah. There seems to be volatility at the senior level, especially in the military and diplomatic corps. I know there's a lot we don't know about this, but I guess my question to you is, do you worry now as you see this political infighting? I mean, we just had 2 days ago 103 sort of PLA ships out in the Taiwan Strait. You know, one theory is they want to signal to the rest of the world that even as they're cleaning their ranks, they're still ready to fight. So do you have any concerns that this volatility we're seeing might affect the way that the PLA is behaving in the near term? Are they going to get more sensitive? Is there the prospect of miscalculation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. Worry about, you know, the mechanism or the institutional tradition of the PLA. PLA had the problems. Doesn't matter what kind of problem they had: corruption, mismanagement, and the power struggle. But usually, in the past, according to my book, during the Cold War and beyond, the party allowed the military to fix his own problem. The party leader, like Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, just tell, you know, which one should stay, which one should go. The military could work out the way among themselves. Not anymore. Now the party have to step in, direct to lay off or replace or dismiss those generals, admirals, because the military lost their traditional political power to fix his own problem. So Xi Jinping ran out of patience. So if you don't do, I will do for you. So that what happened according to the news we learned. And there's more problems, you know, because there's not just the personal individual issues, there's again, institutional systematic problems. You not just move one person, you know, he has a network, has a strong build-up behind or under. So that could be a major blow to the military system.
Brent, I'm glad you talked about China-Russia relations, and it's one of the frustrating aspects of we both work in DC is there seems to be this continual dismissal or that the relationship is defined by tension. I think there's a little bit too much overlearning of the Sino-Soviet split. But I appreciate in your book you, I think creatively about how the Russians and Chinese could work together. I wondered if you could just think a bit aloud about, as we're thinking about the next decade, where might cooperation between the Russians and the Chinese go? And then as a second question, if we're thinking about conflict in the Taiwan Strait, where might we be underestimating the role that the Russians could play, either in niche capabilities like submarines or in creating problems for us in other theaters at the same time that we're looking at Taiwan?
So thank you for that question. That's definitely one that I've been living for quite a while. The partnership, the strategic partnership between Beijing and Moscow is not a natural one. So just allowing natural courses, their own national interests kind of play out, they're not going to be close for long. But Putin's very disastrous and horribly executed invasion of Ukraine in February of 22, it's making him more and more reliant, some would say subservient, to Beijing's interest. That will agitate Russian nationalism. Again, nature take its course, they're not going to be strategic partners for long. But as long as Putin and his power circle is in power there in Moscow, I think we have to assume that this no limits relationship is going to start playing out in ways that we don't really anticipate, and most certainly not to our advantage. Undersea capabilities is the one that I watch on this with deepest concern. And the analogy that I use is if we have a similar type incident like we had with the Walker spy ring and the silencing and milling technology that made its way into the Soviet Union in fairly rapid order, a quieting of submarines, while it's still nowhere near what we could have, what we have, it complicates and causes us to have to allocate more and more resources to go after a single Chinese nuclear submarine or diesel submarine. So that's from a bigger area down to a very specific niche. And there's more, but that's the one that I stay up nights the most worried about. Trying to drive a wedge, like building out a strategy and having a plan to try to force these two apart, that's not something I see as very effective. It would more likely fail, and we would probably do more to bring those two together. Most likely in the near term is that we should try to find ways where Russian interests that don't align with China get accentuated and maybe facilitated and helped, and places where the Chinese have interests that are not in line with Russia to try to agitate those more and accentuate them more, bring them to the forefront. For example, the Arctic comes to mind. That's a place where supposedly on the surface both are working together, but China has covetous eyes over seafloor resources up there, and eventually they're going to run into the Russians. So don't craft a strategy, don't build a plan to try to force them apart, but at the same time, it has to be part of the planning that we do on how we build and how we employ our forces. Actually, comprehensive national power should also inform the diplomats.
In the book, you talk a lot about, and you mentioned in your opening comments on how important allies and partners are to thinking about U.S. power in the region. If we're thinking about a Taiwan scenario, I wonder if you could just give a high-level assessment of where the defense relationships you think are strong and are going to be critical. What might be some that are critical but are not strong?
So for quite a while, if you go back in Tokyo with Prime Minister Abe, he and his administration led and kind of brought an awakening in DC about the dangers and threats from China. So in some regards, I'd say Japan is our staunchest, strongest, and also most proactive ally. Will also play a very direct role, and they've made no secret of that in recent past, that Taiwan's security is intimately integrated into their own national defense. And having been to Tokyo last summer, the environment in the Japanese public is one that I'd never seen in my life. Much more willing to play a proactive military and defensive role in the world, embracing concepts in circles that I would have thought I would view as very liberal or socialist. Kobe University comes to mind, who were embracing concepts of shared nuclear weapons, like a construct that supposedly is in NATO's framework with use of nuclear weapons. So Japan, top South Korea, but South Korea will always be focused in on the north. But there's a lot there in the Sea of Japan or in the East Sea that we also have to pay attention to, and the South Koreans can be a great ally for that. Australia, I think Southeast Asia and the South and Central Pacific, that's a relationship that we, the two capitals, Canberra and DC, need to do a better job. Our interests have not perfectly aligned for a very long time, and we've also had gaps in what's coverage, and this is partly, I think, why we saw the turn of events in the Solomon Islands. It's also why we're seeing perhaps bad things playing out in Papua New Guinea, an independence movement, Bougainville Island. But you also have other places in the South and Central Pacific where playing zone is not working to our advantage. The United States and Australia need to integrate their approach and work in a more integrated fashion rather than playing regional.
Mike, you want to come in?
I just want to make a point about the allies. I think it's important that we keep in mind that thankfully China keeps making own goals to scare the bejesus out of its near neighbors and making it easier for us to improve our relationships with our allies and them and they themselves improving their defense. But before we break our arm patting ourselves on the back, it's important to keep in mind that who's going to show up when the shooting starts? And we don't know that. None of the countries that we're allied with and what have you there actually have indicated, perhaps Japan is the closest, that they would come ride with us to go fight China. So, you know, allies are terrific during peacetime and what have you, but you have to be careful on not counting too much on them when the shooting starts.
Maybe we can segue to, on that, thinking about Taiwan, and maybe bringing together these threads now to try to conceptualize what effective deterrence is going to look like. And maybe we start there. The D word gets thrown around a lot. Oftentimes it feels like we say something is deterrent because we're doing it, rather than understanding how it refracts through Chinese calculations and strategy. You're thinking out over the next 10 years over what are going to be the foundational elements of deterrence. What are they? And this is for all three of you. What are the things we're not doing now that we need to pick up the pace on if we're going to extend deterrence through, let's say, the next 10 or 15 years?
Of course, for deterrence to work, the other side has to believe that you either have the ability to really whack them hard, deterrence by denial, or that you have the ability to frustrate their attempt, in this case, Taiwan, to take Taiwan, deterrence by denial. And so, you know, to answer your question is, part of it is making sure that they believe that we have the ability, that if the conflict escalates, we have not only the capability to respond, but the political will to respond. And in the case of denial, we have to convince the PLA, Taiwan has to help us convince the PLA that they will not be successful. If you try to invade Taiwan, we will be able to stop you. I think it's pretty clear if you think about what's going on in Ukraine, it's pretty hard to stop being bombarded with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and aircraft. And so Taiwan's probably going to take a hell of a beating if it's not an invasion, but just essentially an attack from the air. And that would be difficult to stop even if we had the ability to do that. But if we have the ability to stop an invasion and Taiwan is willing to fight on and hang on, that should be enough deterrent, hopefully. But China has to believe that. And we have to demonstrate that capability and through our exercises and what have you, and our weapons procurements and those things, that they believe we can do what we say or we assert we can do.
And if I'm reading into your implicit comment is we're not quite doing that now.
Well, it all depends. We're not doing it necessarily all of the gee whiz good things that we're talking about having or the more missiles that we're buying and what have you. We're still cranking up the production lines. And so once all of these sorts of things arrive, we'll be much more capable. So the longer the situation that we have today lasts, the better off it is for us, I believe, in terms of our deterrent capabilities. You know, submariner can tell it, but something like 30%, 35% of our commissioned submarines are down for maintenance. And everybody understands that submarines are our ace in the hole when it comes to dealing with a attempted invasion of Taiwan. So we need to fix that problem.
Xiaobing, you've done a lot of thinking about how the Chinese look at the Taiwan problem. What's your assessment of how they are looking at U.S. deterrence and capabilities and to Mike's point, credibility right now?
Right. I think they believe that American armed forces may not, make an immediate response if there's a attack took place. So probably for the first 48 hours, Americans will wait and see what's the situation over there. So that's very critical for the landing force to make determined moves and played important role. So that's the Chinese calculation. But again, at this point, attack Taiwan is not the first choice because of the, Mike mentioned here, the risk, cost, and possible war with America. That's what the Chinese leader had been worried about because a war decision in China is not for the national interest or security, but for the party control. Anything, weaken or threatening to the CCP's leadership won't be, the top choice. So what Xi needs today is a political achievement, or justification for his third term. Don't have to be big, the attack on Taiwan could be on some small island or other, like Jinmen, could be served that role to help him instead of hurt him, to strengthen his leadership instead of weakening his leadership. So Taiwan probably is not immediate war decision for Beijing in the recent years.
Thanks. Brent?
I couldn't agree more. I think the danger, and I certainly don't think we have the luxury of time. I think we are in an a period of urgency for action now. I am one of the believers of the Davidson window that 2027 presents a time at which we reach peak danger, where from Beijing's perspective, they may perceive their advantages reaching a maximum, a window of time to act. And again, it's the perception and its intent. And intent can change in minutes. And it's really what's in Xi Jinping's mind that morning that he wakes up, or before he goes to bed, the decision to go and how. I think in the near term, there's a lot of question marks. One, there's the PLA has a lot of uncertainty about how it would perform in a conflict. But looking at Beijing's war planning, there's also a lot of question marks in their mind about how we would respond and how our allies would respond as well. And so how do you figure out, how do you refine your understanding? You do an intelligence pool. You spike the system. You create perhaps an incident that might serve a political purposes for Xi Jinping personally in Beijing, but at the same time provides the PLA that insight. Where are the actual red lines for the US, the Japanese, the Filipinos? Would the Filipinos invite more US military presence if things start to heat up around Taiwan? These are the question marks. And it feeds into another term of this equation, going to war equals, a positive military-to-military balance. Well, other countries in the region are also spending more money on defense and building up. So that arrow turns down for Beijing. But that other term, the political uncertainty or the effective control, that's what's really holding them back right now. So sowing doubt is what's needed. And going back to this being the most dangerous decade, if we don't play our cards more smartly, we could inadvertently, through ill-informed engagement or unwittingly having a too passive posture in our military forces, our ROE, when the PLA does decide to trade paint with us. We could send a signal of weakness or a green light that further provocation would be warranted. And the unfortunate thing of that is they would cross a red line with not even knowing it. And I think that red line's a lot lower than I think most of our political leadership realizes, because once the bombs start dropping in Taipei, there's 50 to 80,000 US citizens there. No politician in the United States is going to be able to do nothing.
Yeah. Well, this is the part where we invite mass democracy to join the discussion. So we've got some microphones up here. I know Admiral McDevitt's law of question asking is it has to be a question and it has to be concise. So please just your name, your name, and then your question, please. And I'm going to alternate between, we've got some online questions and in person here.
Hi, Talbot Manville, aircraft carrier engineer. Can aircraft survive a fight in the South China Sea?
I guess that's for me.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, actually, I'll defer first to the Admiral.
Well, the issue now is that can the aircraft carrier, can the airfield
That's what I
survive
meant,
the
sir,
fight?
yes.
Right now, it seems that most people are wringing their hands about the fact that land-based anti-ship ballistic missiles with maneuverable warheads as they come down through into the atmosphere could in fact hit a moving ship. And ostensibly the PLA Navy is tested. The only test I'm aware of is they were shooting at a moored barge. Well, that's a little easier target than than a ship going 25 knots. The answer is in most war games, ones that I've played in for certain, people are not willing to rush the carriers forward immediately because they're afraid they're going to get whacked. And the plan now is extend the range of the aircraft, organic tanking on the carrier, the drones that will be used as organic tankers, as well as long-range air-launched anti-ship cruise missiles that collectively between tanking and air-launched cruise missiles, you can fire at 800 nautical miles or 900 nautical miles away, keeping the aircraft out of the SAM problem and keeping the ship safe from missiles. To be determined if it would work or not, but that's the plan, and that's what that's what people seem to be buying.
Brent, did you want?
Yeah, I would add that moving targets are hard, a lot harder than an Air Force base or facilities that are on land. Those are fixed. And that also means you have to buy into a lot of infrastructure to defend them, decoys as well as active defenses. So aircraft carriers are always going to have a role. The other thing is they can move around and you can surge and power project where you need to. That's an uncertainty. It provides the president and it provides commanders a lot of flexibility and a lot of more options. So I don't see them going away. They can take a hit. It hasn't happened yet, so we don't have any historical evidence, but looking back to records from World War II, we need to be very smart about how we repair the aircraft carrier after a hit. And of course, echo all the points made about we need a longer range air wing. We also need to rethink about what naval air looks like. It's not just going to be resident on the aircraft carriers for strike power. It may be on other ships, maybe in other forms. And so I think that's something that's well past due.
Well, I'm
Thanks.
heartened by the fact that you have an aircraft carrier on the cover of your book. Thank you.
Sorry, I brought that up.
I love them too.
Please, and just to the folks who are giving questions online, in fairness to the people standing, we'll clear through this round of standing questions, and then I'll go to the questions online.
I'm Veronica Cartier, member of Naval Institute, an independent think tank. For me, today's discussion, the urgent realities, for me, is the survival realities. To the fact that China aggressiveness with their communist allies, such as Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. And recently, China had military agreement with Cuba that brought PLAN and CCP in our region, less than 100 miles from Florida.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt. We just have many people want to ask the
Yes,
question. Could you just
Let me get this point.
Thank you.
As Dr. Lee's book stated on the overview page, that plan is ready, PLAN is ready to open fire first in defense offense against other sea power like the U.S. Navy. So in my opinion...
I'm sorry. What's the question?
Yes,
Just
I
a number
will,
of
but
people.
then you need to understand the question that, in my opinion, CCP are already in the U.S. soil, in our government system, controlling our leader and decision maker. And CCP already supported and close to Russia, so our situation more dangerous than before. So, all right, then the reality is that my question is, in the survival, how long we have to respond? As China, CCP already have the first strike. They're already inside the American soil. And so when America will respond to their act? Thank you, and I thank you for this opportunity to exercise my freedom of speech. At least I have
Thank you.
At least I have no gag order.
Thank you.
Why don't you answer?
Well, I think that was actually more of a comment than a question, but it was a good comment.
Thank you.
So please, and I'll take this question, then I'll go to one question online, then we'll come back.
So I think Russia's brilliant performance in Ukraine has blown up the Davidson window. And if anything, it's now wide open. It's not going to happen. Why would Xi Jinping do anything without a declaration of independence from Taiwan? Why bother? He's got everything he wants right now. And taking all the comments about his criticism of the military, I would think that he's actually down at the tactical level trying to figure out whether or not his service can fight. Why am I wrong?
You skirted the line between comment and question very effectively. That shit has been used now. No one else can use that strategy. But
I missed the bottom line, which is, what was the question?
So the question is, why do you think we're on the precipice of war?
Well, I don't. I don't think we're on the precipice of war. I don't think that Xi is anxious to shoot us, and I don't think he's anxious to start a conflict. So I think that that particularly with what's going on in China right now, the last thing he wants is a fight.
Well, maybe my question's for Brent.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the other spectrum, but do you want to maybe?
Very briefly, yes, I agree with Admiral McDavid. She tried to right now avoid a direct confrontation with America.
So a couple of things. Ukraine, win or lose, doesn't necessarily send the signal that today's not the day to go to war over Taiwan or the advantage. And the reason that is, Ukraine could win, but the West could be so depleted in its resources and its industrial capacity. If we don't address that, then that's a green light, because we have an empty arsenal and we're a paper tiger in their eyes. And the advantage has been proven out. And that's in the Ukraine victory. Or we pull back our resources and our support to Ukraine, and Ukraine folds. That also signals weakness in the part of the West, that unity of NATO countries and of Western thinking countries is also a lot weaker, and therefore the red lines are a lot lower down, sends a green light to Beijing. So it's how the war in Ukraine ends, and that we take the appropriate lessons to bolster our defense industrial base, to signal to China that, hey, if we get into a fight, we understand it's going to be a long one, and we are prepared for that. If we don't take those lessons, we may find ourselves in a sooner than 27. And again, it's all about intent. If just looking at all of the economic, the military, and the region, if you're just looking from a pure balance perspective, there could be a rationale for acting sooner. And not appreciating that and not taking actions that are decades past due in building our defenses, growing our Navy, strengthening our economy to economic coercion from Beijing too, then we probably are going to make that projection of the prophecy reality. So it's not foregone conclusion. That date, that projection was actually earlier in this decade, 10 years ago. It's shifted because of actions that we've taken, like the rebalance, the free and open Indo-Pacific, and Japan under Prime Minister Abe taking a lot of aggressive actions to grow their own defense, as well as South Korea starting to look outwards. So there's a lot that we can do with our allies and partners to change it, but we can't dismiss it.
I'm going to do, just because it builds on this discussion, and you know, Xiaobing, I'm going to ask this to you. This past 2 weeks or so, as we've seen China's economy undergo significant stress, there's been pronounced concerns about the prospect of a diversionary conflict. The leadership in Beijing feels threatened or sensitive. Xi Jinping might be looking to fend off attacks, and so he looks to get a safe bloody nose, could be on the Indian border. Just to you, how do you assess the likelihood in the near term of Beijing doing something stupid as it tries to divert attention from economic challenges?
Probably some international crisis may, help Xi's political crisis, but we just don't know, when and where. But right now, a couple of possibilities, including the offshore island crisis, and also you mentioned disputed borders along the Chinese-Indian borders and other areas. So those international incidents may help release Xi from the domestic crisis.
Great. Please, you're next, and then we'll go over here.
Hi, Mallory Shelbourne with USNI News. I wanted to follow up on something Admiral McDevitt said. We hear a lot about capability and capacity of the plan, but there is this question of how good are they? Just to follow up on that point, are there any examples outside of pure shipbuilding capacity that you can point to that show the plan's efficacy?
The examples that can show
their efficacy and their reliability?
Well, honestly, I don't follow it as closely as active duty intelligence officers follow it. So this is impressionistic. For example, their development of carrier aviation, tactical aviation, taking airplanes to sea. They've been very deliberate, slowly trying from one thing or another, going, they send out bulletins with the first nighttime landings and whatever, but they have not been in a hurry. They've been very deliberate and careful in taking step by step by step to make sure that when their large carrier that's still under construction is completed and what have you, they can actually have a credible air wing that doesn't have to use jump jets to fly. They'll have catapults, and it will be able to perform with new tactical airplanes better than the ones they have now. I would say that's an example of the fact that they recognize what they don't know, and they're very willing to take the time, spend the money, and move in a way to make sure that when they finally get it, that it's done right. And as I said, though, the one thing until the shooting starts, we don't know for sure. How well will their radars work? How well will ours work? When we see in Ukraine, there's a lot of Russian missiles that look like they're way wide of the target. Is that going to be symptomatic of Chinese missiles, that a huge number of them are not operating with pinpoint accuracy? I don't know. Perhaps people at the classified level know. But so those are uncertainties that we really won't know and hopefully we'll never know, because it would mean that there's a conflict underway. So I'm not sure if I got to your question, but.
You did. If anyone else has any, yeah, it did.
Sir, please.
Alexandre Nuplé. My question is about the China-Russia relation. China does not condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine because it considers that NATO expansion provoked that invasion. And on the other hand, you see that Russia moved closer to China just after the 2014 crisis and was very reluctant to do so at first. So my question is, how do you explain that the United States didn't try to derail or to prevent that close Chinese and Russian partnership, which obviously is detrimental in the context of those two conflicts, Taiwan and Ukraine.
Great, thank you. Brent, do you want to?
So that strategic partnership goes back to 2001. So by 2014, it had been pretty mature between the Russians and the Chinese. But on meaningful military operational level, it really hadn't started to take off. That all changed in 2019 when you had Chinese and Russian nuclear-capable bombers circumnavigate Takeshima Dokdo Island in the Sea of Japan. And rather than Seoul and Tokyo reacting against Beijing and Moscow, they reacted at each other. So they were able to use bombers together in a high level of operational planning, and again, strategic assets. And that's very concerning, but they also expose problems with our allies and partners that also have to be taken into consideration. And so I don't necessarily see NATO expansion as the cause for or bringing China and Russia together. I think it predates actually quite further back than that, because on the issue of pushing back against the United States rules-based order or global hegemony, however you want to characterize U.S.'s role in the post-war era, it's the U.S. and those that are against. And in this case, Russia's interest and China's interest are very much in a line, while they may differ in other places. And it has very little, in my estimation, to be with NATO. And that includes the NATO expansion that some talk about into Asia, which I find is the odds of that is very low. But the relationship is one that should continue to mature with, let's say, like Japan and NATO.
We have exactly 4 minutes left, so if you don't mind, I might take both these questions together, and then we'll let our panelists answer. So please, sir.
Yeah, mine's short. John Kuhn, incumbent Fleet Admiral King Professor at Naval War College, but currently teaching at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. AUKUS, that's for the panel. What is the impact of the AUKUS agreement on the calculus? Thank you.
On what?
The Australian, U.S.,
No, I
U.K.
know,
agreement on the calculus of the region. Thank you.
Thank you.
Phil Bizzelli, taxpayer. If you change all your terminology from the pejorative, Chinese Communist Party, the personalization of the leadership, and just say China, and you look at it in the context of, it could be Thomas Jefferson as the president, Monroe, FDR. How does that change your perspective on China versus the U.S.? And I apologize for using versus.
Great. We've got 3 minutes, so that's a minute each to pick between one or both of those questions. So, Mike, why don't we go to you?
I think AUKUS, I don't know for sure if Xi Jinping is wringing his hands over AUKUS or not, but anything that raises the prospect that there are going to be more nuclear attack submarines running around the Western Pacific is something that is not a good deal for the PLA. The fact that the United Kingdom, another nuclear weapon state with SSBNs and bombers and what have you, is engaged in an alliance with the United States and the Australians, which that seems clearly aimed at deterring China, can't be something that they look at with equanimity. So I would say on balance that AUKUS is probably, now, AUKUS has to work. There has to be an SSN at the end of this story that's out there flying the Australian flag. And I think we have a long way to go before we see that. But conceptually, it's not a bad idea.
Xiaobing?
So the question about the Americans' image of China?
No. If we strip away the Communist Party and we just think of China as a very large country with a different regime type, would we still be in the same rivalrous dynamic, or do you think there would be other possibilities? So is it the party, or is it China that is the challenge? You want to skip?
Probably China, I think. The party, the president, as we know, as any place else, as presenting the history. So they came to power not an accident, not by a revolution. Actually, there were history and the background. And those ideas or policy or strategic culture, you can go back way to Ming and Qing and Song dynasty. Some emperors, believe it or not, had a similar view about countries like Korea, Vietnam. They were not communist for sure, but so it's very traditional. It wasn't just a communist ideology, aggressive or expansionist, but very traditional.
Brent, you get the benediction.
So the hard part first, so if you strip away the Chinese Communist Party, you have to look at national interest. And sure, there is going to be some differences there. Even if the nationalists had won the Civil War, there still would be differences from what that government would have in U.S. interest. But there's a lot of ifs. But I do think the nature of the Chinese Communist Party is on whole actually a driver for a lot of bad behavior and a lot of very dangerous risk-taking in the near term. It's not a very dynamic regime, it is brittle, and that is the danger in it. Now, the easier question, AUKUS, I don't think some future 2040 submarine that could come about for Australia, that's not the dynamic that's weighing in Beijing's calculus. It's what U.S. nuclear presence is going to be in Australia. Think tenders, doing maintenance, sustaining submarines in a fight forward without having to go all the way back to the west coast of the United States or to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. That's something that if we focus in on the near term or bias actions to the next 2 or 3 years, that actually can be the biggest advantage as a deterrent value in AUKUS.
If I could, one PS on that. Submarines, U.S. submarines out of Fremantle in World War II operated in the South China Sea. Factoid for you. Between November and December 1944, we had 14 U.S. submarines operating in the South China Sea.
So here we are at the end, and I would like to recognize Jude Blanchett, Admiral Mike McDevitt, Xiao Bing, and Brent Sadler. Let's give them all a big hand. Enjoyed this discussion. I got the feeling we could have done this for another hour, and it would have still been good. We very much appreciate the fact that you gave us your most precious asset today, which is your time. And for each of you, this doesn't quite cover it, but we've got a copy of our Naval Institute press book, Mastering the Art of Command, about Admiral Chester Nimitz, and The Victory in the Pacific by Trent Hone, one of our authors. And we thank you, and also we invite our audience to join us out in the foyer again, where we'll continue with book signings for all our authors. Let's give them one more big hand. Thank you. Okay.
Okay.